That sounds good. So we'll get started, and people can just trickle in as they can. So we're happy today to be here to discuss Community Conserve. So there's been a few changes to the platform, so we're going to go over that. And then Jason and I are going to look at 4 new resources that we've developed specifically for Community Conserve for municipalities. So my name is Holly Kinnis. I'm a conservation analyst at the Miistakis Institute. I've been here for about 5 years now. As you can see, I am working from home. So hopefully my dogs don't interrupt us. It's way too hot to work with the door closed, so they're kind of hanging out with me in here. So let's get started. So I'm just going to go over a quick tech overview. So you are muted by default. We'll be using the Q&A for any questions that you may have, and we're going to address those at the end of the webinar. We have 15 minutes set aside for a question and answer period. So if you have a question, feel free to pop it in the Q&A. If you have any comments or you're experiencing any technical issues, please use the chat box for those. And when you do that, if you want the comment to be seen by everyone, please make sure you choose the all panelists and attendees feature in the chat box so that everyone can see it. If it's a tech issue, you can just set it to the panelists, and that's Jason and myself, and one of us will try to help you out with whatever settings. So I think we should be able to, Jason and I were chatting away, so you should all be able to hear me now, but if not, frantically type it in the chat right now. And Jason will flag it for me because I can't see the chat too well. So the Miistakis Institute is a nonprofit charitable applied research institute, and we're affiliated with Mount Royal University, located in Calgary. So we do research that is accessible to communities and decision makers so that they can make choices that promote healthy landscapes. The Miistakis office is located on the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, and the Environmental Law Center's offices are located on the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 6 and Treaty 7. However, both of our conservation organization work takes place on many different traditional Indigenous territories. And we acknowledge all the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. Community Conserve, providing environment and conservation resources for Alberta municipalities. So as I'm sure you've gathered from by now, that Community Conserve is a project of both the Environmental Law Center and the Miistakis Institute, with the support of the Alberta Urban Municipalities Association and Rural Municipalities of Alberta. And I think I saw some familiar faces from those organizations in the participant list today, so hello. For those of you who are new to Community Conserve, I'm going to be reviewing some of the functionality of the program, as well as providing an overview on some of the recent changes that it has undergone. Community Conserve is an online platform where Alberta municipalities can access well-researched environment and conservation information. They can share issues and ideas that municipalities are facing, and they can even pool resources. Since we launched Community Conserve, we've been evaluating it, and our assessment has told us that some things were working and some things were not. Since our goal is not necessarily to have a website, but to rather support municipalities in their environment and conservation work, we zeroed in on changes that would better support that goal. So the biggest change that we have to Community Conserve is the shift away from project development to the provision of resources that will support municipalities in their environment and conservation aspirations. So there is now an expanded resource library with improved search capabilities by categories. So this is kind of a snapshot of it here. And you can see, I believe you can see my mouse. You can see all the different categories here. So you would just click on one and it would bring up all the resources that are relevant to that category. We have also developed a site search function as well, which seems like a simple thing, but it's very useful when you're looking for something very specific. So like with many websites, it's accessed by clicking on the magnifying glass, and then you can just type in your keyword search and it'll bring up anything on the Community Conserve site that has that keyword in it. The Ideas Forum has transitioned away from project development, and it's now a place for municipal personnel to continue to share ideas and issues, and then vote on the ones that resonate with them. And then what happens is one of three things can happen. So the Environmental Law Center and Miistakis can adopt a project and seek funding for that project to carry it out. A municipality can request that the idea is moved to the fund pooling category, and then fund pooling can be pursued. Or a municipality is able to get in touch with the author of that idea if they want to discuss it between the two municipalities on their own, and we can facilitate that process. So here we have what the fund pooling page looks like right now. So while this is no longer the focus, this functionality is still available. But when there's currently no projects in the fund pooling page now, so if you go and visit the website, you'll see that. But once projects are in there, there are options to either get more information about that project or to start a conversation about pursuing how to go about fund pooling. And Community Conserve can facilitate that exploration process. So with so many changes, you might be asking, what is staying the same about Community Conserve? So like I said, the goal is still the same: support municipalities in their environment and conservation work. All the completed projects are still available free of charge. The support functions are still there, so the Ideas Forum and the facilitation for resource pooling. And then the website is still the platform, and that's communityconserve.ca. And I would encourage you to visit our website, look at the revisions, let us know what you think of it, and please reach out if you have any questions at the email listed here, which we'll put up on the screen later for question and answer if you don't have a chance to jot it down now. So moving into the new resources that we've developed. So the Environmental Law Center and Miistakis have created 4 new resources as examples of the types of projects that can be facilitated through Community Conserve. So Jason and myself will now just spend a few minutes going over each of these resources, which are all freely available on the website right now. So roadside restoration for pollinators was an idea that was proposed by a municipal staff person on the Community Conserve website. So the Miistakis Institute developed this resource to assist municipalities interested in restoration and management of marginal lands, such as roadsides, to create low maintenance pollinator habitat. And while we use the terms roadsides, we recognize that these are also referred to as transportation right-of-ways or roadside ditches. So there's a variety of terms that are often used for the area that we're talking about. We also recognize that the term marginal lands is regarding to the land's benefit to pollinator habitat, which might be marginal at the time. But we recognize that these lands play a significant role for vehicle safety, and they would not be considered marginal lands in regard to vehicle safety. So for this project, we initiated a survey to determine what types of projects municipalities in Alberta are currently undertaking to support their pollinator populations. We also conducted a literature review to summarize beneficial management practices in roadside maintenance and restoration of pollinator habitat. And as well, we've gathered relevant case studies and resources to guide municipalities that are interested in pursuing these types of projects. So what we found is that there is much information on beneficial management practices for incorporating pollinator habitat along roadsides. However, these practices have not yet been fully adopted and incorporated widely throughout Alberta or Canada. There are only a few case studies in Alberta that provide information on beneficial management practices, successes, and cost benefits specific to managing roadsides for pollinator. However, there is a growing interest in this field, and there's a lot of pilot projects underway. And those are great because they're going to provide a lot of much needed information to address some knowledge gaps. So what our survey showed is that Alberta municipalities are supporting a wide diversity of pollinator projects. So the most common project topics are pollinator habitat on private property, herbicide use information, and some marginal land reclamation, which we were, of course, very happy to see. Alberta's municipalities are mainly using outreach and education, as well as best management practices to promote pollinator conservation. Policies and bylaws are less common. We also found that maintaining roadsides to support pollinator habitat, in addition to their traditional uses, is possible. I know it might sound like a feat to begin with, and it's definitely something that requires a commitment, but there could be cost savings as well. So what we looked at with cost savings is that they may arise from reduced mowing practices and reduced or altered application of herbicide. For some of the case studies we looked at, typically there was a higher initial cost of doing these habitat restoration projects, but then about after three to 4 years, they started paying for themselves. So the costs were greatly reduced after that initial kind of 3-year project timeline. And one limitation is that native seed mixes are still a bit of a constraint due to their availability and cost. And again, that's also associated with the higher upfront costs for restoration of these areas. So the development of an integrated vegetation management plan that incorporates practices supportive of pollinator habitat is integral to managing roadsides for biodiversity. We also recommend that municipalities in Alberta pursue small pilot projects to continue to gather information on the successes and cost-benefit information that can be used to champion additional projects or changes in roadside management policy and practices. So council, ag service boards, and community support are also very important to ensure the sustainability of projects and also to ensure that projects get off the ground and have the initial support that they need. We also recommend the creation of an Alberta community of practice. And this is really to leverage success, share resources, and ultimately make progress towards making roadsides a source of biodiversity, including pollinator habitat. And this, of course, is a lovely monarch butterfly. I was so proud that I was able to put this video in and it didn't glitch or be laggy for all of you. So I hope it's not too laggy. So for more information, this is a snapshot of our resource library. So you can find our full report in the pollinator category, and it has all the information that you need on the background research that we did for this. So I'll now pass it over to Jason for him to highlight the 3 projects that he's been working on.
Thanks very much, Holly. Yeah, it's something that I certainly haven't really thought too much about, but would like to see a lot more of in terms of pollinators. More pollinator habitat would be great. So I'm Jason Unger with the Environmental Law Center. I'm just going to share my screen now, and hopefully it'll work. So people can see the, oops.
Yeah, it looks good, Jason.
Good. So, as Holly had mentioned, the Environmental Law Center and Miistakis Institute had developed these other report and resources. These reports that the ELC undertook are really into 3 main reports. One dealing with environmental reserves and environmental reserve easements, and a discussion of the regulatory context and application of environmental reserve under the Municipal Government Act. The second one is basically an update on the industrial activities report we previously did under the Community Conserve work. We felt that there was a need to update that work and to do a bit of a deeper dive into the issue of municipal planning and environmental autonomy around planning. And finally, we looked at how municipalities, what are the options of municipalities for generating revenue to pay for conservation measures. And I'll get through each one of these in a short presentation today, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So starting reverse order of what I just said, paying for conservation. It's a real challenge. I think everybody recognizes that the challenges can be significant in terms of that. I see a chat. I'm not sure if maybe Holly, if you can look to see what the chat question is or if there's an issue. So I'll continue on here. So paying for conservation is obviously a problem or a challenge for many municipalities. And with the economic outlook of Alberta, obviously that's going to be a challenge moving forward. So when we think about paying for conservation, obviously we have to kind of define what we mean by conservation or environmental management. I kind of use those phrases interchangeably. But really, when you think of the costs, they're quite extensive, or they can be in a utopian world of management and environmental management. First, there's the need to kind of understand the state of the environment. What is our current state? Ideally, the ability to model future states, understanding what types of drivers and risks there are involved in environmental management, and understanding how we can go about restoring or maintaining these ecological functions and ecological systems. And then there's more of a planning process that is ideally undertaken around how we are going to set objectives around biophysical issues, around specific species, tying those into social and economic and recreational outcomes, as well as the ecological services aspect. And it gets quite complex, as many people on the webinar might realize. When we're talking about ecological function, for instance, of wetlands in a region, flood attenuation, water quality issues, it quickly becomes overwhelming. So because of this, I think oftentimes we jump to kind of effective governance and implementation of environmental management approaches. And for municipalities, this is really focused on municipal development plans, on down through area structure plans, inter-municipal development plans, and the land use bylaws. It may also go into land acquisitions and regulation of public lands or municipally held lands. And then, of course, the implementation side of compliance and enforcement, wildlife management, all those types of things. And we might have incentives and programs that accompany these educational things. I'm reminded of some recent ones around feeding wildlife that municipalities have been pursuing. So really the focus, typically we kind of jump to governance systems and implementation, which is fair enough because we do have limited budgets. But when we think about if we're going to be strategic and kind of objective based in terms of our environmental management, it can be quite challenging, and the resource needs can be quite enormous. So what are the real options available to the municipalities? And there's, under the Municipal Government Act, unfortunately, there aren't tons. So there's property taxes, of course, which are the bulk of resources that municipalities get. Of course, they're based on fair market value, or for instance, in agricultural lands have a different tax rate. There's also local improvement taxes and special taxes. These have a bit more flexibility in terms of local improvements, but they're really focused under the MGA on infrastructure more than anything. So to look at these as a broader conservation revenue generator is a bit of a stretch. Like, I think occasionally you could kind of get a local park or that type of thing established under these tax regimes, but it can be a challenge. There's also the community revitalization levy, which is basically relies on boosting local taxes through development. And really that also has limited availability in conservation worlds. And as we've seen lately, especially, I think there's some challenges with that in terms of realizing the property tax revenue boost that we're hoping for, particularly now because of the pandemic and other issues with our economy. There are also offsite levies, but again, they're quite limited in terms of how a municipality can use those to deal with their issues. So this isn't really a tax option, but there is also the issue of cost recovery that I think is important for municipalities to consider in terms of their operations. And for instance, if they have bylaws around impact assessment or environmental assessment, the process by which there's an ability to recover some of those costs of administration and review is an important aspect as well. And finally, again, not a tax option. I should amend this the slide here to illustrate this. There's also natural person powers. So user fees and borrowing and investment opportunities. Many of you might have heard of things like green bonds and that type of thing, which are an option. But there's challenges with those in terms of debt limits and just general carrying of those debts. User fees can be used. Obviously, we use them more in the nature of kind of recreational centers and ice rinks and that type of thing. But we could certainly see an expansion of that in certain areas, for instance, for parks and that type of thing. Obviously, they're also contentious, and they have the issue around equitable access for those who do not have the resources to take advantage of those. And we certainly don't want to limit through user fees the ability of people to participate in the natural world. That's certainly counterproductive, I'd say. So there are examples in British Columbia specifically around municipalities having a more general services, local area service focus, and this has resulted in some bylaws being passed on regional conservation funding, and basically the ability in BC it's not that stark or different in terms of legislation, but it is reframed around services rather than kind of infrastructure. So their municipal law allows for more regional voting on basically like a referendum on conservation funding in that area. So I think that's one thing that Alberta should consider in terms of law reform around. Obviously, we're going to see budgetary constraints on the future. Municipalities also rely heavily on grants as well, as many people would know. But there's also the overriding kind of understanding around paying for conservation is that flexibility around municipal revenue generation is quite limited. And if our expectation is that municipalities take on a lot of the planning, a lot of the assessment, and a lot of the challenges around water and water bodies, other things about parks, and even to the extent of biodiversity, I think there's a need to extend our horizons in terms of our legislative powers here. And I know that certainly some municipalities have been advocating for that in the past. Okay, the second report I'm going to be touching on is around municipal autonomy and the environment. So this report sets out the evolution of legislation, and I'll touch on it in the next slide, and case law regarding how municipal decisions and provincial decisions interact. And it kind of starkly contrasts some of the challenges of municipalities of planning and their planning function and land use management function and regulation function, and the provincial mandate for certain resource extraction and other types of things like that. And oftentimes the end question is, well, is there conflict or is there convergence in the approaches that we see? And frankly, I think, again, some of these reports, these more recent reports are kind of flagging areas where I think there's a real discussion to be had around law reform, because there often is a conflict, and we see that play out in decisions, and it's a challenge to get around that. And I'll talk about that a bit more. If we look at how the Municipal Government Act has evolved and how that has impacted environmental, what I phrase as environmental autonomy of municipalities, we see in 1991, the Planning Act was amended to limit conflicts with provincial authorizations. And that's embodied in Section 620 now of the MGA, the Municipal Government Act. And it basically says if there's a conflict between a municipal permit and provincial authorization, then to the extent there's a conflict, the provincial one prevails. Now, there's been case law since then that basically said, well, if there's the ability of dual compliance, then it's still okay. So that's to say, if a municipality has a permitting process that is more stringent or has a higher environmental standard than a provincial one, they can both work together. It just requires the activity proponent to go through both processes. So there isn't a conflict. It's in fact complementary, and that follows past court decisions as well. Then in 1995, Section 619 of the Municipal Government Act more clearly sets out the paramountcy of regulatory approvals of the Alberta Utilities Commission, or the AUC, the Alberta Energy Regulator, or the AER, and the Natural Resources Conservation Board, as well as their predecessors. So the ERCB is also in there. And this is quite distinct and has been distinguished in case law between Section 620 and 619. And it's clear that the regulators in these cases have the ability to authorize things and basically frustrate municipal plans or municipal kind of environmental management outcomes. That's intentional, of course, because there's the policy objective of increasing efficiency and making sure there's some consistency across the province. Of course, what we give up is perhaps some ability of local people to decide what they want in their area. It's a kind of an economics versus local autonomy issue. In 2001 and 2002, permitting of confined feeding operations were limited under both AOPA, which is the Agricultural Operations Practices Act, and the MGA. And that was a result of kind of ongoing conflicts around confined feeding operations and litigation around that. So we saw that happen in 2001, 2002. 2009 was an attempt to deal with some of these conflicts in the Alberta Land Stewardship Act, but it is clearly states that regional plans are paramount and that municipalities have to declare that they're compliant with those regional plans. 2016, we see that the Municipal Government Act was amended again to kind of limit how the bodies of water framing around the legislation was defined. And that was basically more broadly, more open to broad interpretation, and now they've limited it more. And I'll talk a bit more about that in the environmental reserve part of this presentation. And finally, and perhaps most relevantly, and part of the update was due to this 2020 change, and that's the centralization of appeals, of subdivision development appeals and development permitting to the Municipal Government Board, and including in this is approvals from Alberta Environment and Parks. And this change, I think I'll talk about a bit more briefly here. So as I've mentioned already, there's this tension within the province, and it's not surprising in any way. There's a provincial need or want to have consistency across the province for certain regulatory approvals and the efficiency gained in that system. On the opposite side, there's the principle of subsidiarity, meaning that basically that principle stands for the notion that the people closest to an impact of an activity should have a level of say in that activity. Now, I should say that the provincial laws do provide often directly affected parties to participate in those processes. And they may also provide for specific municipal participation as well, especially around confined feeding operations. There are some definite planning rules for municipalities there. But it also is contrasting of provincial agencies which don't have a local planning mandate and knowledge base against the municipal planning mandate And that's where I see the potential for the highest conflict. So these arise often around energy, agriculture, and the environment. And an example of this was the Natural Resources Conservation Board, and this is detailed in the report, where a municipal development plan attempted to set setbacks from water bodies for specific activities. And this was rejected by the board in that case because they have their own setbacks, and they viewed that there wasn't enough kind of scientific justification for having the higher setback. But of course, we're not going to have a host of literature reviews and citations in a municipal development plan. So it creates this potential issue where how one can justify a planning outcome in an area where it may not be well suited for a statutory plan, for instance. And frankly, the most recent amendment in 2020 had to do with a lot of past case law, a lot of development and subdivision appeals related to aggregate extraction. And it's been a long-standing focus area. There was a lot of appeals in the report. I highlight some of those. And now those appeals have been centralized in a provincially appointed body, further minimizing kind of local planning autonomy. So the question becomes how can this evolve in a way where environmental planning, if we're not getting it from the Alberta Environment and Parks, because that's not really their mandate, or regulators, because that's not really their mandate, and we're not necessarily seeing it in regional plans to the extent that the conflicts are being minimized, then what are the options from there? And I think that's the challenging question from here. So as I mentioned, I guess I just highlighted these. They don't necessarily have planning goals, line departments or regulators, or capacity or relevant authority. So it is this conflict and perhaps downloading of some of the challenges on municipalities whereby their responsibility and authority is somewhat limited. And now going on to environmental reserves and environmental reserve easements. This discussion document kind of dives into some of the regulatory and definitional issues around environmental reserve. Environmental reserve is certainly a central part of environmental planning, and I think more importantly, perhaps for municipalities, is around risk management. We've seen litigation in the past for houses falling into the river and that type of thing for municipalities, and other issues like that. So it is essentially around risk management, and a lot of things come down to how are things defined in environmental reserve and where is there uncertainty remaining. So just to reiterate, for those who aren't familiar with environmental reserve, it's basically land that may be taken by a subdivision authority at the time of subdivision, and it follows into the three main categories: swamp, gully, ravine, coulee, or natural drainage course; land that is subject to flooding or is, in the view of the subdivision authority, unstable; or a strip of land not less than 6 meters in width abutting a bedded shore of any body of water. The Municipal Government Act also sets out purposes for these lands, and it really falls into 4 categories: preservation of a natural feature, pollution control for water bodies, ensuring public access to water bodies, and then the risk one around safety of development. And some of the interesting areas, well, interesting to me anyway, is how we go about defining certain terms within the environmental reserve. And because this is a mandatory, once a subdivision authority decides something is ER, it is basically transferred to the municipality without compensation. So it's an area of contention when somebody is subdividing. And so you can get into kind of very definitional conflicts, right? So what is a swamp or land subject to flooding? What is a natural drainage course? Some of these definitions are not aligned with our evolving knowledge of, for instance, wetlands, ephemeral wetlands, those types of things. And there's been case law, and I cite it in the report, around things like natural drainage courses. One case said it can't just be a general slope, even though the water goes a general way. They focused, the court in that case, focused on the term course. It has to have a defined course. Similarly, things like land subject to flooding. Well, is that 1 in 100 year flooding? What is the baseline of that 1 in 100 year in light of the weather we're having now? I mean, we see shifts in climate and flooding. You think of the 2013 flood incidents in southern Alberta, and it's a challenge for sure. And then there's body of water. And this was the 2016 amendments where basically they sought to align the Municipal Government Act with the Public Lands Act and the Crown ownership of the beds and shores of body of water. And that is that it's a naturally occurring and permanent body of water, or river, stream, and that type of thing. So what does naturally occurring mean? When you think of all the augmentation that we've done to our waterways, it's easier said than done to say, oh, that's naturally occurring. It's a question really of extent, I think, in terms of what is naturally occurring. Like a clear irrigation canal is not naturally occurring, but there's often works on a lake or a river that would augment the nature of that, but the naturally occurring nature of it is still underlying that. And this issue came up in a recent Court of Appeal case where it was a civil suit. So it's not really just on point, but the court in that case did find that even though there was some indications of major works that impacted the water body, there was an underlying naturalness to it, and it was still Crown owned, and therefore it was still naturally occurring. Similarly, around permanence, the provincial government has a variety of policy around how they determine permanence. That's specific to Crown ownership. Another issue that I think is important in the environmental reserve and maintaining natural states, as the Municipal Government Act requires, is that there is a need for bylaws around regulating environmental reserve, as well as policy supports to determine what the best use of those areas are. So there's no need to necessarily allow public access, although most municipalities do allow that, but there is a need to ensure that it's maintained in its natural state. And what does that natural state look like? If you're going to attempt to manage it for environmental outcomes, there's going to be a need to ensure that there's an understanding of the baseline and probably a identification of the activities that might be impairing that or degrading or destroying that natural state. And then there's the issue around enforcement as well. So there's, depending on the nature of the environmental reserve, certainly if it's just 6 meters wide, then I can see challenges, not only if it's 6 meters wide around a water body, but there's obviously a lot of challenges with how we manage these lands, you know, for invasive species, for erosion, for all these things that have to be dealt with. So that sums up my presentation. Here's the website of the Community Conserve website, sorry, and as well as an email for you to consider.